Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a very special session of the Columbus Metropolitan Club. My name's Jane Scott, and it's a privilege and honor to serve as the president and CEO of this wonderful organization and be the first to greet you on our Wednesday programs and on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our program committee and our mighty staff of 4.5. So we're happy to have you here. So on to the program. Sometimes life takes us down these strange and wonderful little rabbit holes that are very unexpected. And in 1992, I was very deep in one of those rabbit holes. And I crossed paths with this very remarkable human being whose name was particularly difficult to pronounce, but well worth remembering. And over many years, we have maintained a close and unique friendship and have kept in touch. At first it was by email and then by Facebook, and every now and then we would be able to get together in person. Well, while here I am in Columbus, Ohio, sharing things on Facebook about my garden, the Columbus Metropolitan Club, my husband and my kitties, I'm getting Facebook posts from him about dignitaries that are being celebrated at the United Nations and pictures of world leaders signing these historic agreements. And very gracious and humbly, he would comment on my kitty pictures. So this is the kind of friend that he has been over the years. His biography is printed in your forum flyer. His travels and his career has taken him all over the world. Many hot spots, many high-profile positions. He's been behind the scenes with countless global events. Our speakers work side by side, hand in hand with many heads of states. He's witnessed much of world history, and sometimes he's even made some world history. So we're delighted to have him here today, and the Columbus Metropolitan Club is very, very honored to welcome the Chief of Staff of the Director Council of the United Nations Office in Geneva, David Chikvidze. And with David on stage is another remarkable man and good friend. We'd like to welcome the Chief Content Officer and the host of Columbus on the Record at WSU Public Media, one of our partners, Mike Thompson. Mike, David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jane. I was trying to figure out a funny, low-key way to start this off, and I was really struggling. So I said, I know what I'll do. I'll find out how the state of Georgia and the Republic of Georgia compared, find the similarities. I got nothing. But I did find two things. They both drive on the right side of the road, and they both have funny accents, right? Yeah. So we'll talk about leadership during this morning session, and then the afternoon, after the lunch session, we'll talk more about the few things that are going on in the world right now and get your take on that, David. But let's talk about leadership. The U.S. is experiencing right now, I guess you could say, a period of anti-establishment leadership. Donald Trump is overturning conventions on a daily basis. Sometimes he's overturning the conventions that he overturned the day before. You served under an anti-establishment candidate or politician and leader in Boris Yeltsin. We can't compare what's going on now to what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union and the start of the Russian Federation. But do you see any similarities between Donald Trump and Boris Yeltsin? Feel free to say no.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, thank the Metropolitan Club of Columbus for inviting me and for getting Maya and me over here. I want to thank my very good friend of many years, Jane, for organizing this and hosting us here. I'm very happy that along the way I lost the ability to blush because your introduction was a little over the top. Every leader has something in common, especially leaders who buck the tide. I worked for Yeltsin for 11 months in a non-political job. I'm a Georgian, and when I was proposed to go back to the administration, it was in the Office of Protocol, and I said yes because I knew it would not be a political job. And I actually did my work conscientiously. However, without that little spark, working for his predecessor, Gorbachev, whom I considered to be my president because my country was a part of the Soviet Union. There, when I would run into a roadblock in pushing some idea from a foreign embassy or something about a meeting or whatever, I would then go around to the other assistant to the president and try to find a way. I insisted because I thought it was a good idea. With Yeltsin's administration, I would do my job, go to the assistant, not interested, fine. You know, I did my part. In answer to your question, it's hard to compare. They were they're very different characters, both very political. I should actually take a step back and say, as a UN staff member, I shouldn't even be commenting about any of this. I should say this is your domestic affairs, and I'm not going to say it.
It's just us.
Yeah, I know, yeah, just us.
The whole YouTube thing, no one will see it. You know?
Nah. But I think, you know, President Trump, for all the negative sort of comments that he gets, there's quite a few things that he's doing that probably needed doing. Whether they should be coming with the particular tweets that they are coming with or the particular rhetoric is a different matter. But I'll say in general terms, this is purely my view, and I'm saying what I think as an observer and as a participant, and just like you are, you all have your own opinions. With the fall of the bipolar standoff, you know, you remember all the euphoria about the New World Order, et cetera. Well, we're still not there. We left that behind, but we're 27 years into this period. We're still in transition. We're moving somewhere. We still don't know where that somewhere is and what that somewhere looks like. And I think President Trump is shaking things up. I think this might be, historically, when we look back, perhaps the world needed somebody in the US to do unconventional things, to go against the tide, go against norms that have been established. I'll give you one example. When this whole talk about meeting with the North Korean leader started, conventional wisdom, the talking heads on every channel talked about, well, how can you meet with this horrible dictator without thorough preparation? He could set enormous numbers of traps where our president will fall. Well, for one thing, why be so defensive and why be so insecure about Kim setting traps for the US president? But the other thing is that he did it the other way around. Not the way that conventional wisdom would suggest. Let's first sit down at the highest level, talk, see if it clicks, and then let our staff and professionals do their job. Whether it's the right way or not, I can't say, I won't say, but it's one way to do this. Because the other way, let's talk about first all the details and then get together, that was the way the US dealt with the Soviet Union. But that need not be the pattern to deal with everybody else. The Soviet Union was the only country who could have destroyed the United States as a viable society because of the nuclear weapons.
Let's get to those days. Let's get to your time with your president, as you said, Mikhail Gorbachev. What role did you serve under for him?
Well, I started out after my 5 years in Washington, the Soviet embassy, assistant to the ambassador in chief of protocol. I was invited to join Gorbachev's protocol office, and being I was 32, enthusiastic. I knew the White House in and out because of the 3 summit meetings and over a dozen ministerial meetings. So I thought, wow, White House, Red House. And finally, I thought we're becoming civilized, because before that, it was the Secretary General or the general secretary of the Communist Party and the Central Committee. Now there was a presidency, and we were moving towards something modern. So I was very enthusiastic about it. Little did I know that in a year and 3 months, I'd be out of a job, Gorbachev would be out of a job, and the country would fold. But the last 2.5 months after the August 1991 coup, I was promoted to deputy chief of his front office, as it were, which I thought was pretty good for a 33-year-old Georgian in Moscow, in the Kremlin. But no, that was the end of that career.
So did you work with Gorbachev when he was interacting with Ronald Reagan, either in the U.S. Embassy or in Russia, in the former Soviet Union?
In Washington, especially in 1987.
So how were they together?
They got on famously, actually. I'll tell you a story that preceded it from the Geneva Summit meeting, the first one they had in 1985. Sometime in 86, maybe, Charles Wick, who was a personal friend of Ronald Reagan's and director of the U.S. Information Agency, came to the embassy to see the ambassador. And those of you who remember him, he was a feisty guy with a biting sense of humor. And he said, "Mr. Ambassador, I have to step back for a second. The reason I was there is because my ambassador could speak English, but he didn't understand it." Well, I mean, he understood it, but not the nuances, so he needed an interpreter. But then he could express himself in a rudimentary manner. So Zwick says, you know, what is it with Gorbachev? What is it with your president? You know, Ronald Reagan is a guy who loves humor. He uses humor to break the ice and tells one-liners. And he told one joke, your president didn't laugh. He told another joke in Geneva, your president didn't laugh. What's the matter? Doesn't Gorbachev have a sense of humor, or do you have a lousy interpreter? And the ambassador is kind of taken aback, and he says, "I'm going to tell you a story, and I'll see how your interpreter interprets, and if you don't laugh, I know my story is good, so your interpreter is bad." And he tells this story. Before I started interpreting, I told the ambassador, sort of in a half whisper, I said, "Whatever he says and I interpret, you laugh."
Diplomacy in action right there.
It was actually a very funny story. He said that somebody posted an announcement, a notice on a lamppost saying "dog lost." Description is white with black spots, is missing part of his right ear, blind in his left eye, limps on his right hind leg, has part of his rear shoulder sort of bitten off, answers to the name Lucky. So this is just to illustrate that Reagan did his best to get on with Gorbachev, and they did. They really did, and you can see that in footage of Reagan's visit to Moscow when they're going on this walkabout on Red Square, and Reagan is kissing babies and so on. And I forget which journalist said, "So, Mr. President, do you still think this is the evil empire?" In his inimitable way, Reagan said, "Well," he didn't answer the question. He dodged it. But obviously, he didn't want to say that it was. And it's interesting that...
Was it Sam Donaldson who asked that question?
Could have been. I don't remember.
Did you see that, him yelling that question?
Yeah. The relationship between Mrs. Gorbachev and Mrs. Reagan was also cordial, but I think Mrs. Reagan was a little bit put off in '87 when Raisa made a point to show off that she knew the artworks in the White House as well as Nancy. I was kind of upstaging her a little bit, and both being strong characters, there was a little bit of tension in the air, but then it dissipated and they became the best of friends.
How about Reagan's famous call, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall"? Did President Gorbachev say, "Yeah, that's a good idea"? How did he react to that?
You know something? I'll go back a couple of years back and say that the one person who really ensured the demise of the Soviet Union was Margaret Thatcher, who in 1984, when Gorbachev visited as a line secretary of the Central Committee for Agriculture, I think he was, and they stepped out from number 10 with their spouses, and the journalist yelled, Prime Minister, how was your meeting with President Gorbachev? And Margaret Thatcher famously said, Mr. Gorbachev is a man that the West can do business with. That one phrase, I think, raised the bar so high that Gorbachev and then Yeltsin both went out of their way to take that bar each time. I heard Yeltsin many times say in the corridors or somewhere where somebody would approach him and say, Mr. President, we should do this. He loved referring to himself in the third person. And he would say, but what will they think in the West about the actions of the Russian president? See? And Gorbachev as well. So Gorbachev took on board what Yeltsin was saying. He argued, but I think Gorbachev's mistake was that he was hoping that if he got rid of the worst sort of aspects of the Soviet Union and the most threatening things that the Soviet Union did to annoy the United States, that the US would come to his rescue. And the rescue meant economically, because the country had stopped producing by the mid-'80s. Well, I think it was kind of Pollyanna on his part, because for a country that had been the source of the biggest sort of concern and danger to the United States, why would he believe that the United States would jump and bail out the Soviet Union once it was on its knees? So I think that was the big, and that's why his critics, Gorbachev's critics in Russia, and they are many and numerous. He's actually considered as a not very smart person who also had tinges of traitor in him, whereas Yeltsin is considered squarely a traitor. Yeah. No fool, no nothing, just a guy who was doing somebody else's work.
What was that day like, Christmas Day, 1991, when the flag, the Russian Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin, the Russian flag went up? I remember watching Gorbachev's speech on TV that day. What was that day like?
Actually, that Soviet flag has never been found. Somebody appropriated it, wow. And maybe it'll surface on eBay at some point. You were watching on television. I was standing in front of Gorbachev in that room, and it was a surreal experience for me. Again, because I'm a Georgian, I found myself in the space of those 19 minutes standing in the same room, the same building, the same Kremlin, same city, different country, because my little country had broken off somewhere on the periphery. It was totally different from my Russian friends and colleagues who were standing around, because they didn't feel that. They were still in their own country. Yeah. I must have had such a miserable look on my face that the then president of CNN International, Tom Johnson, was standing next to me, and he took a look at me, took off his CNN watch. It was a Korean watch, but with CNN on the face, and said, if you ever need a job, come and see me. I appreciated that very much, but I did not follow up on his suggestion. It was a surreal feeling. I'm not usually a person who's given to emotions and ups and downs. I'm pretty level and strong, but at that moment, I knew what was coming. But when it happened, I was like, where do we go from here? Do I stay in Moscow and pretend I'm a Russian? Wouldn't work. I can't do that. go back to Georgia? I'd love to, but the country was in a total upheaval. And Maya and I spoke, and I said, well, we could go back to Georgia. I'd probably engage in politics and have a very interesting career, but our son is going to go, who was 7 years old. But he'd probably go for 3 to 4 months to school out of the year, to an unheated school, and you know, God forbid he might come back with a knife wound or something at some point. You know, she said, "What other options?" I said, "Well, I could try to find inroads to get into the UN, and then we go to New York and." He could study in the UN school or some other decent school. And he said, "Yeah, okay, that's it. That's your job. Go work on this." It was a tough time, and all the waypoints suddenly disappeared. There was no orientation. You couldn't find your way around anymore. It was you were on your own.
Ronald Reagan gets a lot of credit for ending the Cold War, for bringing down the Soviet Union. Do the U.S. policies of the 1980s get too much credit in that?
That's a very good question. Nobody's been able to come up with a definitive answer. Ronald Reagan had a huge role, but he didn't bring the country down. It was Gorbachev primarily, but most importantly, it was the Soviet economy that stopped producing. Any society throughout the millennia that stopped producing died inevitably, or was taken over by somebody.
Why did it stop producing?
It stopped producing because the Soviet economy was a command economy. It was put together by Stalin, weighed on a pharmacist's scales. Everything was precisely measured, and one important component was fear. And when Stalin died in 1953, that component was taken out, and successive governments in the Soviet Union could not come up with anything that would take the place of that particular component. There was no material interest that could in any significant way be added to take that place. And on top of that, there was incompetent economics management of the economy. The last competent person who was ousted in 1975 was Kosygin, Premier Kosygin. He was a really smart person. He came up with an economic plan that if Brezhnev hadn't fired him out of insecurities, political insecurities, and had adopted that plan, the Soviet Union perhaps would still be in existence. But instead of that, Kosygin was fired. The Minister of Defense, Ustinov, got his way, and the Soviet Union started building SS-20s and putting them in Europe for no good reason, pointing a nuclear gun at the temple of NATO and the US. And at the same time, the dollar price fell to around $9. Today, when it comes down to 50, they're saying, oh, the oil producers are in bad shape. Well, back then it fell to $9.
This is oil a barrel, $9.
A barrel, yeah. So a combination of these factors led to the downfall. Now, Reagan's role was that he didn't dilly-dally. He just went full throttle to confront the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev, I think, to draw a parallel with a different era, I think Gorbachev was the one who blinked. And especially when you talk about SDI.
This was the Star Wars space defense.
Strategic Defense Initiative, which Reagan announced in March 1983, I think it was. Gorbachev truly believed that the U.S. would be able to achieve a workable, dependable strategic defense initiative, space-based. And he knew better than anybody that the Soviets did not have the economic wherewithal to compete. And so that is what explains what happened in Reykjavik. In Reykjavik, Gorbachev basically put on the table every type of missile. He was ready to give up everything as long as Reagan would give up SDI. And it was, from the US standpoint, it was scary because the president was out there negotiating without any preparation and
That sounds familiar.
Exactly. I was about to say, very, very familiar. And from the Soviet perspective, the Soviet military was aghast. Gorbachev was out there totally off the farm. But the US noticed that this guy is ready to give up everything, given the right incentives. So Reykjavik was a big, big watershed in the relationship.
Turning to other world leaders, what world leader have you met in your career that you said, man, that person is surprisingly smart and a terrific leader? Who have you come across that has sort of wowed you?
If you give me the latitude to include not only heads of state,
Yes.
hands down, James A. Baker III,
Former Secretary of State.
former Secretary of State. An incredible guy. He has integrity. He has 10 out of 10 times you sit across the table from Jim Baker and try to negotiate something. 10 times out of 10, he is going to come out a winner, but in such a way that you're going to walk away and say, what a guy, he beat me fair and square. You're never going to say, oh, what he did to me, I mean, I can't even think about this.
But was it a negotiation where you lost or you just didn't get what you wanted?
I never negotiated with Baker, thank God.
Whoever was negotiating, was it
I worked for Baker.
a win-win?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the reaction of the Soviet foreign minister's team. In 1988, when George Herbert Walker Bush became president or was elected, you might recall, some of you might recall that there was a pause, a hiatus in the relationship with the Soviets. There was nothing happening. There was no initiative to have a ministerial meeting. There was no talk about a summit. The Soviets were really, really worried. What is this? It was a new approach and so on. And finally, when the ministerial meeting took place, some in Shevardnadze's entourage, who were the smartest and the best and the brightest that the Soviets had at the time, they came away from the first meeting, and this deputy foreign minister said, oh my, these are the people we have to negotiate with and win?
Wow.
He said, it's not going anywhere. We're not going to be able to do that.
What world leader have you met and you said, oh my God, what's up with this?
Oh, that's easy as well. Everybody sort of said, oh, I'm busy, sorry, try this guy, maybe he'll go out and greet him. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I've got a doctor's appointment. Everybody ducked. I was left to greet, guess who?
Former president of...
Yeah. And so he arrives at the UN, and there's just, two cars. I'm the only guy standing there. There's nobody behind, or the direction that I'm facing, behind his back. There's nobody on the right, nobody on the left. He gets out of the car, he greets me, then he turns around and he starts waving to the non-existent crowd in the back, on the right, on the left. I could only imagine how it was photoshopped afterwards. That there were adoring crowds screaming, and that was really not a good experience.
We Americans, we see foreign leaders as foreign leaders. We see Vladimir Putin and Pierre Trudeau and Angela Merkel as leaders of countries, but they're not foreign leaders. They're domestic leaders. So
for them, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I would say almost maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of their, if not more, of their work is focused on their domestic audience because that's who puts them in power. How does a how does an international leader balance, an effective international leader balance the needs of his or her people and being a world leader?
The best answer to that is to quote Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. It's a very good question because most of the things that politicians do on the international scene they play to the domestic audience most of the time. It's almost a universal rule. Some leaders who are more attuned to the communications aspect do this with greater sort of attention, but everybody does this. Because in the final analysis, what happens? You go out to a meeting somewhere, an international meeting, you come back and you have your right wing criticizing you. You have your left-wing crazies criticizing you, which usually is a good sign, so you've done something right. You're in the middle somewhere. But and you can't really deliver on the international stage if you can't deliver your own audience and your own government and your own country and your own different parties. That was the problem, I think, of Gorbachev to a great extent, because what was the difference between how James Baker did business and how Eduard Shevardnadze did business? Baker would do the usual due diligence, consultations with the Defense Department, with the intelligence community, get everything vetted by the president, have option one, secondary option, and the third no way back option. The way that Shevardnadze would do this, he would go out on a limb, he would negotiate with Baker, something interesting that the US side liked. The Soviet generals on his delegation were grinding their teeth and then objecting. And then he would call Gorbachev or come back and report and say, well, look, I went out on a limb, I did this, I achieved this, but these retrograde generals of ours, they don't want to play along. So Gorbachev would pick up the phone and scream at these guys. That's not the way to do it. The Baker way is the right way to negotiate. And another thing Baker taught me, he said, David, if you've got 10 people sitting around a multilateral negotiation, and at the end of the day, 9 of them go back with something to their country, and just 1 doesn't go back, consider that the negotiations were a failure. Because everybody has to go back with something.
We'll take some questions from the audience. CMC's tradition is to encourage folks to join our conversation, so please go to the microphone there. The Secretary General of the UN, talk about a thankless job.
No.
That person is not only herding cats, they're herding cats and mice and trying to get them all to get along. What type of leader does that take? Yes. What type of leader what qualities does that leader have to have? Was Trygve Lie, the first, he was Norwegian, the first Secretary General of the UN who called this job the most impossible job in the world. I would probably opt to call the job of Human Rights High Commissioner as the more impossible job. For the simple reason that you're head of one of the departments of the Secretariat, you're supposed to serve the member states like any other department, yet you're also supposed to be the voice, the moral voice of humanity and the namer and shamer in chief, which just doesn't go together. But the Secretary General's job is very difficult, and it's also very different depending on the era. In the Cold War days, or right up to the end of the bipolar world, the Secretary General, like Kurt Waldheim or somebody, was considered a high-level mailman. He would take a letter of one superpower, and take it to the other side, and then bring back the other side's letter. That was basically it. The Security Council was hamstrung, as was the entire UN, but it was
it was a way to do business. It was a different era. This Secretary General is very different, especially compared to his predecessor, who was more sort of scripted, more kind of regimented in what he did. And he said, this Secretary General is a brilliant individual. He can, he sums up in 15 minutes his trip with 4 or 5 stops, but doesn't just tell you what he did. He tells you, gives you an analysis of the problems in a nutshell with such clarity that it just makes you proud to be working for this guy. He needs the member states to help to play and to walk in lockstep with him. They hired him. They hired him because he was the best. They need to give him a little bit of support. The problem is the UN has a number of risks. Let me just. It's a wide, large question. The UN is an organization created by the member states. Yet, in the minds of the member states, the UN, if undefined, it seems like the UN is an entity unto itself. Well, it's not. I am a hired hand, just like about 10,000 of us. So is the Secretary General. But the organization belongs to the member states. So that's, I don't want to go too long into it. We have a question,
Sure.
two questions lined up.
Sounds like NPR. Go ahead.
Yep. Morning, I'm Julie Keckstein. I'm a banker with PNC. I'm so curious, what was your early life and education like, and what was your road to come to the U.S. Embassy?
Thank you. Well, you may have realized I'm a Foreign Service brat. Maybe not, but I am. I was born and lived in Georgia and Tbilisi until I was 8. Then my dad was posted to Bombay, India, for 2 years. From there, he was transferred to London for 4 years, where I went to school.
He was a diplomat for the Soviet Union.
Yeah. And then we came back. I graduated from high school, spent the last 4 years of high school in Tbilisi, and then went to Moscow to study at the Foreign Service School, which was the only foreign service school in the whole Soviet Union. If you wanted to pursue a diplomatic career, that's where you needed to go. And after that, I sort of branched out on my own. I spent another 3 years after my initial 5 years at the school doing my PhD and waiting for Maya to finish her medical college, which took forever. And and then finally, I was posted to Washington, to the embassy, which was my golden dream. I was a U.S. nut. I was crazy about the U.S. I was reading everything I could. I was a couch potato in England, in London, and watched everything that came along. And they did an amazing job programming the best of British television, the best of American television to 2.5 channels. It was like ITV, BBC One, and BBC Two half a day.
What was your favorite show?
Oh, Star Trek.
There you go.
I'm still a Trekkie. I sign off when I write to my son on WhatsApp that we're about to take off. I say, Kirk out. But the original Star Trek, none of that new generation.
I'm with you on that one. When, what's his name, didn't have any hair, now he has tons of hair. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Kathy Fox with the Pizzuti Companies. Some people say that the United Nations is irrelevant and we don't need one anymore. What's your perspective on that and why?
My perspective is the exact opposite of what you quoted, and not because the UN pays my salary. Because the UN is a neutral player. It doesn't have any vested interest in any status quo. And it's a neutral table created by the member states themselves in order to have a place where they could negotiate and resolve problems that they can't resolve outside of these structures. It was like an agreement. When we run into problems, we have a fist fight in the parking lot, let's go into the UN machinery that we created and let's negotiate there. That is actually the reason people think that the UN is irrelevant is because the member states themselves do not use the UN the way they were supposed to when they invented it. They bring their fist fights into the UN. And in the Security Council or in the Human Rights Council, they continue, instead of working towards a resolution of a problem, they work to mark points against each other. And that's why, unfortunately, even though it's an anachronism, the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, even that we can't even talk about in any reality because it's now the P3 versus the P2. The permanent 3 meaning the US, Britain, and France, and the P2, Russia and China. And it needs to be addressed, but the way it's addressed, the best addressed, to my mind, is to engage in diplomacy and engage. Do not pronounce the UN irrelevant if you haven't done your job in negotiating as much as you can to reach negotiated agreements. The UN should not be a place where ideological or other battles are fought. It should be a place where negotiations are conducted and resolutions to problems achieved.
Andy, do we have time for one more question?
Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Richard Burnett. I'm the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church, which is located just over your left shoulder, in a manner of speaking. I'm wondering, I tend to be a hopeful person, but I find some hopelessness rooted in Tip O'Neill's quote.
In what, sorry?
Tip O'Neill's quote, all politics is local. We use that a lot. I'm reminded that the member of Congress from Charlestown and Cambridge who preceded Congressman O'Neill, John Kennedy, said of his great book that there's a real good reason that Profiles in Courage was only 1 volume. And I think that all politics is local tends to diminish the courageous spirit of internationalism. And I think now particularly, we need to really challenge that point of view. And I hope that your presence with us is an invitation for us to look beyond our local boundaries and really think of ways that not only we can arrange opportunities to help one another get along, but actually become bigger and larger. I am so urgent about that, and I hope there's a spirit that we can meet around that, sir.
You tell he's a preacher.
Thank you very much. I agree with you, and perhaps this is a good example that people should not be quoted out of context. I think Tip O'Neill was talking about something else, yes, but I thought that applying that to this question was appropriate because politicians do play to their domestic audience.
I was really preaching to us, not to you. So thank you.
Okay, we're going to have.
And I want to say that I have a special place, me and Maya, for the Episcopal Church because our son Alexander went to Washington Episcopal School for the last 1.5 years of our stay in Washington D.C. And he loved it. Still remembers. There were some lovely people there.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, wow. Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Won't you join me one more time in thanking Mike Thompson, David Chikvitsa. We will see you very shortly.